Our moderator tonight is Sikina Jinnah. Sikina is an associate professor of environmental studies and a valued member of the executive board of the Institute. Her research focuses on global environmental governance, in particular in the area of climate change, climate engineering, and the nexus between international trade and environmental politics. I think Sikina is an ideal moderator for the event tonight, as her work in many ways is similar to Rhiana's, especially in the ability to cross traditional boundaries and think about climate solutions from new perspectives. Sikina is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow and the author or editor of 4 books and many articles in the field of global environmental politics, including her most recent book, Greening Through Trade: How American Trade Policy is Linked to Environmental Protection Abroad. Sikina, I will now turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Katharyne. So with no further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest tonight, Rhiana Gunn-Wright. Gunn-Wright is the Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute. Before joining Roosevelt, Gunn-Wright was the Policy Director for New Consensus, charged with developing and promoting the Green New Deal, among other projects. Previously, she served as the Policy Director for Abdul al-Sayed's 2018 Michigan gubernatorial campaign. A 2013 Rhodes Scholar, Gunn-Wright has also worked as a policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department, was a Miriam K. Chamberlain Fellow of Women in Public Policy at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and served on the policy team for former First Lady Michelle Obama. She graduated magna cum laude from Yale in 2011 with majors in African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Before I ask my first question, Rhiana, I want to take a moment to thank you for making the time to not only be with us here this evening, but also to make some time earlier in the day to speak with some of our students. We've already been receiving feedback from them that it was an incredibly inspirational and helpful conversation, and we're just really grateful that you took the time to spend, to inspire them and to engage with them in such a meaningful way. So we're so delighted you're here. Thank you so much for making the time for us.
Delighted to be here, and the class was a real treat.
Lovely. So before we dive in, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your path? How did you become interested in climate justice? And what advice might you have for students and others in the audience who are interested in becoming more engaged in issues of climate justice?
Yeah, so my path to climate justice is pretty indirect. Particularly, I feel like in a space where a lot of people have been engaged in this fight for decades, have studied these issues. I came at it a bit from left field. So I've been working in policy or studying policy for the last 10 years. And I started my career actually working on welfare policy and higher ed policy focused on single parents, particularly single mothers, and then went from there to policing and then worked at a health department. So my work has always been about systems. I was always interested in systems and the idea of how do we use policy to essentially re-engineer the systems that we have. Because if we can sort of create all these horrible outcomes, why can't we create something different? And so that's where I started. And that's what sort of guided my work. And for a while, I was like pretty agnostic about exactly what the topic was. And so climate justice happened for a couple of reasons. One was because I needed a job. I had finished working on the campaign and I didn't have a gig, and I was essentially planning to go to law school and finally make my mother happy. Long story short, Representative Ocasio-Cortez had endorsed the candidate that I was running for, or that I was working for, and they reached out later and said that they were working with this new think tank that was trying to develop a Green New Deal, and things sort of just went from there. And I became intrigued and interested in it because of the systemic aspects of the Green New Deal. It's really about system transformation. And that was really exciting to me. But also, on the campaign, we had a very big environmental portfolio because Dr. El Sayed is an epidemiologist who actually studies social determinants of health. And so one of his big issues was environmental justice. And so when I was at the Detroit Health Department, it was the first time I had actually worked on environmental justice. So my first project was actually to figure out how to get the city to essentially break a contract with a private incinerator that was in the middle of the city. And then, things just sort of went from there. And now I'm really grateful, and it feels like the one space that I actually might stay in for a long time. So that's exciting. And I say for people who want to get interested, really just start from where you are. Climate justice, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, involves so much. Often we're talking about nature. When we talk about environment, we think often about the natural world. And then when we're talking about environmental justice, about pollution, but when climate touches everything, right? Police violence has an impact when it comes to climate change. Questions about trade have an impact. Questions about design and architecture and the use of public space and urban planning. All of that is connected to climate. And so there's a lot of lanes in. So I just tell people, I guess my advice is to find a lane. You don't have to become a climate scientist overnight, like to become involved or be a climate scientist at all. And then find your people, right? The reason I've been able to stay and grow this work is because I do it in coalition with a lot of folks. And I just think the nature of this work is that it just needs to be done in community, both because of the scale of what we're trying to do, but also to shoulder just the emotional burden to some extent. These are scary things to talk about and to face down every day and to try to work on. And the strength that comes from facing it with other people, I think, is really crucial.
Thank you for that. It's incredibly inspirational. And I think I speak for all of us in hoping that you do decide to stick with climate justice for quite some time. We need you.
I mean, why not? Everything's involved in it. Why go anywhere else?
Absolutely.
One-stop shop.
Well, let's talk about climate justice some more. I think we'll probably be spending most of our time talking about it. And so I'd like us to start with a common foundation and with a definition, because we have quite a broad audience here tonight and want to make sure we bring everyone along with us. So let's start with the definition of climate justice. And I'll start by telling you how I talk about it in my classes, and then I'll invite you to respond and correct me or extend as it relates to your own work. So in my classes, we talk about climate justice as being fundamentally, climate change as being fundamentally about justice, because the impacts of climate change and the capacities to respond to those impacts are unevenly distributed across populations. And importantly, we talk about how those who have contributed the least to causing this problem, largely through greenhouse gas emissions since the mid to late 1850s, are sadly those who bear the greatest brunt of climate impacts. And this is in large part because these populations have the fewest resources to respond and to adapt. And when we personalize that statement and look at who those people actually are on the ground, across the globe, we're talking about poor communities and communities of color. So in short, climate change is fundamentally about environmental justice because it disproportionately impacts poor communities and communities of color. So how would you extend or correct me in the basis of your work on these issues?
I mean, I think that covers so much of it. And I thank you for that definition because, again, there's a lot of definitions I think that people use of climate justice. And it's really exciting to hear from you as a professor how you define it. The thing that I would add, I think, to that is I think it's climate change is fundamentally about environmental justice because it does disproportionately impact poor communities and communities of color. But I would add to that, I think it's important to also talk about the way that climate change is an outgrowth of systems of racial oppression in particular, but also of colonialism, of patriarchy. And I think that that's really important because when you think about climate change as just a matter of emissions or technical fixes, you miss the way that climate change is able to happen through a pretty unique set of circumstances, in the sense of when you're talking about something like the use of fossil fuels, we wouldn't have gotten to this place if not for the unequal power relationships that are possible through white supremacy, right? You cannot extract oil as cheaply as we do if you don't have the ability to stomp on the people, right, who are sitting on that land, right, to ignore indigenous treaties or to ignore treaties with tribes, right, to push out indigenous people. And also to dump pollution on communities of color. And so I think it's important to think about the way that that really impacts us structurally. So like just thinking about fossil fuels and environmental racism in the context of the US, I often ask people, do you think that we would have continued to use fossil fuels in a way that's unabated and for as long as we did if we did not have people that we could poison without consequence? Right? And now we have a fundamental issue when it comes to how we move forward, because that split has also created literally different realities wherein people of color, particularly in frontline communities, understand the dangers of fossil fuels because they're getting cancer, they're getting asthma, they're having getting heart attacks. They understand why fossil fuels are so poisonous, and they have a real urgency to move off of it. Whereas the folks that have more power, who tend to be richer and whiter, live in a universe where they don't really see the consequences of fossil fuels, except when we talk about emissions. And so now we have an issue where we need collective action, and the folks with power don't see the problem in the same way as people without power. And that is all about the way that white supremacy operates. And so to me, it's important to think climate justice is also a framework in which to think about how we got here, not just because we burn fossil fuels, but what has allowed us to burn fossil fuels in the ways that we have without abatement, and what is keeping us from moving forward. I think that's one of the ways that I think about climate justice, as well as for me, I think climate justice in my own work is also, in addition to being a framework, is a reminder that justice has to, everything that we do to mitigate climate change has to be done in a just way. And I think that for me, climate justice reminds me of that, because it reminds me that if we're talking about economic transformation, then that has to be done justly. If we're talking about how are we going to change the distribution of physical space, right? So people don't have to travel as much, that has to be done justly. It's just a reminder that climate is more than just the environment, but that a lot of things make up the climate. And you're also, a lot of things make up the climate, and that all of those things have to be tied to justice.
Thank you so much for that. That's really going to enrich my definition as I move forward in my classes.
Oh, good.
Yeah, absolutely. Any favorite books or reading material?
Oh, about climate justice. So, okay, well, this is sort of self-serving, but all we can say, I have an essay in that, but I like it because it's a feminist anthology about climate, and there's like poetry and art. It's just a much more holistic way of thinking about climate. And there's a lot of talk about climate justice. The Red Deal, which is like a critique of the Green New Deal from Indigenous tribes, I think is really helped me think about climate justice in a different way, as well as the People's Regenerative Framework that comes from the Climate Justice Alliance, which is essentially a framework about how do we think about climate justice. particularly in the context of policy change. So all of those are really helpful, and you can't go wrong reading Bob Bullard, Dr. Bullard as well, or Dr. Beverly Wright.
Absolutely. I'll probably circle back to ask you about the red deal once we get into the Green Deal, the Green New Deal. But maybe we'll shift gears to that. And again, sort of definitionally, can you start us off by just telling us what it is for folks who may not be as familiar with the Green New Deal? What is the Green New Deal?
So the Green New Deal now is a few things. So the basic idea of a Green New Deal at its core is about a proposal for a 10-year economic mobilization to decarbonize, create millions of jobs, and redress histories of inequity. And really at the heart of all of that, what ties that together is a real commitment to changing power relationships and using basically what is a moment of intense investment and really moving a lot of resources, using that to actually change power dynamics and power relationships to empower particularly communities of color and low-income communities, fossil fuel dependent communities, to empower them so in a way that they haven't been, as folks who have largely been left behind by the federal government or just by these sorts of government interventions. Really using that to change the power relationships, and also around things like corporate power, monopoly, really asking what are the power imbalances that have gotten us here? And as we try to dig our way out, how do we fundamentally reshape those so that we don't end up in the same place? At the same time, the Green New Deal is also now a movement. There's a Green New Deal network that is made up of 15 base building organizations, from Movement to Black Lives to Working Families Party to Sierra Club. That's the hub of that movement. But there's state affiliates. There's California for a Green New Deal right there. So the Green New Deal is also sort of an organizing tool. It's something that a movement has organized around to push. And then I think the Green New Deal is also, particularly if you look at the resolution towards the end, a set of principles around how you engage in this sort of economic transformation to decarbonize, and how do you do that in a way that's just. So some principles around how you move around that, because you'll hear sometimes people say like Green New Deal-esque. That's often what they're meaning. It sort of looks in principle either like the mobilization plan, or it lines up with the principles of a Green New Deal.
Great, thank you. When I think about the Green New Deal, and one of the things that makes it so important is the way that it serves as a reframing device in the way we think about and talk about climate change, right? As drawing on some of what you've already said, it kind of really pushes us to stop thinking about climate change as a technocratic problem that's all about emission reduction, and pushes us to think about it as one that's fundamentally rooted in questions of social justice. And so my question is, to what extent was that what were those conversations like when you were working with the team in drafting the New Deal? What were the types of things you were really hoping to see included to sort of shift or to push that reframe? And what were some things that maybe didn't make it in that you would have liked to have seen in the document?
Yeah, so when we started out, so I started working on the Green New Deal in September of 2018. And that's when we started developing it in earnest. And we approached it first as a question of economic mobilization. So when I was brought on to help design it and scope it, figure out what a Green New Deal was, because up until then, basically all that had been said about a Green New Deal, even by folks who campaigned on it, like Representative Ocasio-Cortez, was that it was a World War II style mobilization for climate. But then when you dug in, we had some fundamental questions. Not just what is an economic mobilization, we knew what that was, thank God. But how do you run an economic mobilization? Not in wartime, right? And in the context that we have now, what does it require to have an economic transformation like that? When you're saying, because when you say we're going to shift off of fossil fuels, that's like saying I'm going to stop eating food, right? Like you are changing your energy source fundamentally, and that changes everything. Imagine if you stopped eating food, right? If it was like tomorrow, humans don't eat food anymore, you eat, I don't know, red algae. Think about how much would change. Not just like grocery stores would change, but or what will restaurants serve, but like supply chains, the balance of power now. All of a sudden, red algae farmers are like, where is that? How do you transport it? How do you change it? All of those things fundamentally change. And so there's no reason to think that shifting off of fossil fuels wouldn't also be a really big fundamental change. So what does it take to do that efficiently? And what does that entail? And then what tied all this together is, how do you do all that in a way that's just, right? How do you do all that without reifying racial capitalism again and again and again? And so those were the conversations where we started off. And so from the beginning, what we were trying to do, and me in particular, was figure out how do you sort of design an economic mobilization that is systemic and economy wide, and then figure out how to do that work in ways that doesn't just not do anything bad racially. Nothing is racially neutral in the US. But how do you do that in a way that actively gives back power, opportunities for ownership, opportunities for wealth creation, democratic control in a way, over investments in a way that we've maybe never done, and certainly not done since the New Deal. So those were the sort of questions that we were engaged in. And so we knew that climate justice was part of it, but actually, I don't even think we were using that language at the time when we were putting it together. We were sort of talking more in terms of structural racism and economic inequality. But of course, as we continued to grow, and particularly as we started to engage with more and more activists and more folks from environmental justice backgrounds, the language changed, even though the ideas largely stay the same. And if I could do it again, we really didn't pay enough attention, one, to gender dynamics. Climate change disproportionately affects women. And we didn't really grapple with that nearly as much as we should. And also, when you're talking about economic transformation, much like race, you have to think very purposefully and intentionally about how to include women, particularly when you're talking about increasing a lot of jobs where women are not traditionally part of those sectors. And then international. I think one of the things that we're pushing for in the Green New Deal is just sort of like an open reckoning with the costs of what we have done, that fossil fuels are not without cost, that people die every day from air pollution, that these are actual real things that are happening. And we have to recognize that this is what fossil fuels have wrought, and this is part of the reason why we have to get off of them. But the same things exist around renewables to some extent, not nearly to the same level, but renewables, there's issues with extraction. They're not neutral, right? They're not without downsides. And I think, and without talking about the international aspects, that gets really buried. And I think we run the risk of trying to be very just within our borders and not caring at all what happens outside of our borders. And that's not climate justice either. And so I think that's an aspect, trying to knit those together and bring a more international sort of focus is something that really needs to happen. But honestly, it's tough because domestic circles and folks who work on climate domestically and folks who work on internationally are actually pretty siloed, at least in DC and at the federal level. So it's not, they aren't connections that are made naturally, but it's something we absolutely have to do unless we want to say we should be just here, but have completely coercive relationships with developing nations.
Thanks for that. One thing I always try and put myself in a position of how do I respond to the naysayers, right? I try and think through those types of questions. And let's say you found yourself on an airplane sitting next to someone who kind of pushed back on this question of these intimate connections between climate change and social justice. And they sort of said, oh gosh, well, yeah, I see that these issues are parallel to one another, but really at the end of the day, we need to reduce our emissions. And they're really pushing for it, kind of a technocratic, let's just reduce emissions, and that's the most important thing. How do you respond to that person sitting next to you?
That's a really good question, and it's funny because it's a conversation that I had many, many times, particularly in the first 6 months after the resolution came out. I mean, there's a few ways to respond. I mean, I think the first is that a reckoning with political realities, which is that it's going to be very, very difficult to reduce emissions as much as we need to, as long as people of color are disenfranchised to the extent that they are in the US, right? Like I tell people often that the same institutions that you need for a functioning multiracial democracy are the same institutions that you need to effectively fight climate change. And what I mean by that is that as long as there is an ability for a minority party to both like entirely ignore climate change as an issue, and then to maintain control through sort of Senate and the Electoral College, all of these systems that were set up, in fact, to truncate the political power of people of color and Black people in particular, then how are you going to move forward, right? Unless you're going to figure out how to change the GOP overnight, you have a much better chance of actually just shifting power so that the voices of like the majority of Americans who do believe in climate change are heard, and they have the political power to vote out people who don't believe in that, right? But as long as you have gerrymandering and all these other things, that makes it incredibly difficult. So I would say to that person, I mean, that's fine, but these issues of racial justice are tied to even how you get the power to legislate the reduction of emissions in the first place. Mm-hmm. So that is one thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is very similar to what I said before, which is we're dealing with some of the most powerful industries that might have existed ever in human history. They don't want to stop making money. So what makes you think, given how effectively they have used racial divisions to both sow misinformation and prevent collective action on these things, why do you think that if we don't sort of address that they won't find another loophole, that this won't happen in a different form? And also, reduction of emissions has so much to do with people who are wealthier. They drive most of the emissions, and the ability to have that sort of concentrated wealth is about income inequality, which again comes back to racial capitalism and white supremacy. And then if they don't believe all of that, well, then that's God's problem, not mine.
Yeah. Cheers to that. Maybe in line with kind of continuing the thread of critiques, you mentioned several minutes ago the critique from Indigenous communities, the Red New Deal critique. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what that critique says and what you learned from it and what you might have sort of shifted in your work in response to that.
Yeah, so the critiques around, the main critiques I remember from the Red Deal that stuck with me were around capitalism and growth. Because in many ways, and particularly in the ways that we talked about it in the beginning, the Green New Deal can become a form of green capitalism, right? That's about investing and making money. And the only thing that changes is green instead of fossil fuels, right? The power relationships don't change. It's still racialized, et cetera. And so they had a critique around that, around since capitalism got us here, is it really going to get us out if the Green New Deal is just a form of capitalism? And then one of the other things that they brought forth, which a movement, the degrowth movement, has also brought forward, is that one of the main issues is this idea of limitless growth and a focus on GDP and growth above all, not counting the social costs. And the Green New Deal, we often talk about growth, economic growth, and the way that it will create jobs, and how that played into a narrative of like, all we have to do is switch to fossil fuels and we can keep growing infinitely, and that we hadn't talked enough about the sort of the bind of this being about there being a finite set of resources, and that growth cannot happen in an unlimited way. And so I remember those things in particular, as well as they talked a lot about the respect for Indigenous knowledge and the ways that that hasn't been respected and wasn't guiding the vision of a Green New Deal. And so I took all of those things to heart. And I think in sort of as the movement has grown in particular, there's more Indigenous involvement, and the ways that we talk about those things have changed. And the way that I talk about the Green New Deal has changed too, in the sense that I often talk about it as now as a tool that will allow some growth, but that we have to recognize that, like, even if we need the sort of growth in order to turn around, it's not something that can exist forever, and that there should be a move towards eventually being able to move to a less capitalist system. And so really emphasizing, because the Green New Deal is not meant to be a permanent thing forever, it is conceptualized as a time limited economic mobilization, even if the principles should guide action for longer. The sort of very intense amount of sort of investment and transformation, that is an interim step, not sort of the final destination.
Thank you. You know, one thing that I've been wondering about is how the name was chosen, right? When we think about the original New Deal and the role that the original New Deal played in the 1930s in further entrenching inequities for communities of color through some of the kind of New Deal institutions like the Federal Housing Authority and its promotion of things like redlining and exclusionary lending practices. In some ways, that there's a lot of baggage associated with that name when we're thinking about social justice. And I'm wondering if the team that was responsible for drafting it and building it, that you were part of, was had that conversation and talked about the name.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about it.
We have that conversation a few times. And actually, we had some alternate names. I can't remember what they are right now. And one of the reasons, I was actually always a fan of the Green New Deal for a couple of reasons. One is because one of the things that we're trying to get across with the Green New Deal is that it's a governing agenda. It's sort of a full government thing. It requires everyone to take part. There's elements of sort of public job creation. A lot of the things that we wanted to bring in happened in the New Deal, and they're just one of the only references that Americans have to that sort of all hands on deck, we're going to change the way that this is moving. And we also wanted to, I liked the name in part because I felt like it also harkened back to the New Deal wasn't just, I mean, the New Deal did a number of things, racism, public employment, but it was also in a lot of ways a referendum on sort of unrestrained capitalism. And that's when you also saw the rise of unions. And so some of the things that we were trying to harken back to were there. And also people, when people hear the New Deal, they generally have a good feeling. Even, you know, not always people of color, but even, you know, I think it's sometimes, I think for a lot of people, including like a government nerd like myself, it's sort of hopeful. Like it's sort of a memory of what you can do and what is possible. And then I also liked it because I kind of wanted to take it back in the sense of we're talking about redressing harm. So like, why do they get the name New Deal and they get to keep it just, and then we don't get to use it because they were racist? Like, I don't like that. But ultimately what happened is it just stuck. The sit-in happened, Sunrise called it a Green New Deal. Then all the papers called it a Green New Deal. And then it was just too late to rebrand. That was it. Because I don't think people always realize there was maybe, if you're counting everyone, maybe 20 people involved in sort of the creation. And it was all relatively new orgs. Sunrise had been around for 2-3 years. Justice Democrats had been around for 1 or 2 years. New Consensus had just started. So we didn't really have the infrastructure either to rebrand. We didn't have like a ton of money or power. So once every paper starts calling it a Green New Deal, we didn't actually have the firepower to be like, just kidding, the name something different.
Yep. So what are your hopes for the future with the Green New Deal now that we have Biden in office and democratically controlled Senate? What do you expect to see, or any exciting policies that might be coming down the pike in your estimation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot. It took me, I didn't really believe it until after the inauguration. Then it took me still like 2 days to really reckon with the fact that we are in a different moment. And we are in a moment where, I mean, we went from an administration that was it the EPA or DOE? They like wouldn't let them say the words or write the words climate change, right? They rolled back all sorts of regulations and they really went hard in the paint to support fossil fuel industries. Like, and now you're coming to this administration that is actively talking about climate all the time, in some ways really tied to climate, not just as part of their plan for economic recovery, but also because of political reasons, right? This is also the first president that got elected in part on climate, and that is very, very accountable to climate activists, particularly young climate activists. And that is like filling the administration everywhere from the Federal Reserve to like this new Office of Domestic Climate Policy with people who care about climate and if not climate champions, people who are convinced that the government should do something about climate. And then you have a Democratic Senate. So I mean, a lot of things are moving. I mean, they've already committed to, in the second, after this initial relief package, there's going to be sort of a big recovery package where that's where they're doing the long-term, long-term investments. They've committed to that being about climate. They've committed to 2035 carbon-free electricity. They're still sticking behind their commitment to 40%. Although now they're talking about benefits from investments instead of investments, which is troubling. But that exists. And then, I mean, I'm already working with folks who are trying to figure out what parts of climate can happen through budget reconciliation, because that's where all the Senate is headed. And I mean, through budget reconciliation, you can't do things like 40% investment, but you can greatly increase the amount of money to environmental programs. And so I think that we could see a lot. The thing that I am afraid of and hesitant is a lot of equity comes down to implementation. Top lines are one thing, but how you do a thing matters, right? So when you're talking about 40% investments, how you map out the communities matters. The criteria that you use for frontline community matters. What you mean, how you link that mapping to who gets what matters. What you invest in matters, right? Even down to how federal grants are structured matters, because it could mean that only the best funded nonprofits and big white contractors get the money. right? When it comes down to communities. So that how you do contracting and subcontracting, even at the state and local level, matters. And so I have a lot of hope around the top lines. I do think that they are, you know, committed to climate, but my hesitancy is about implementation, because that is really what does go from sort of a Green New, changes it from a Green New Deal-esque program to green capitalism, right? And also we've seen some movement on fossil fuels, but a lot of it so far is temporary moratoriums. And while that's great, um, part of, I think, what's really needed is an sort of an active confrontation with the fossil fuel industry, or at least an administration that recognizes that the that the government is going to have to take, particularly the federal government, a really strong stance when it comes to figuring out how to wind down fossil fuels. And I think that that's a really big part of climate justice, like a really big part of making sure that we actually tackle environmental justice. And so far, I haven't seen exactly that, but there are at least signals that the Federal Reserve and sort of the US Treasury and that sort of arm of economic policy is taking climate risk seriously and trying to figure out how to drive investments away from fossil fuel companies and their operations.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. I'm hoping
that's a nice way to
genuine.
put it.
Thank you. I want to talk about some of your more recent work that connects COVID recovery to climate change. Before I ask you a question about that, I just want to remind everyone that you can put questions into the Q&A box, and we'll take those probably in the next 10 minutes or so. So please continue to enter those in. So Rhiana, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about some of the recent work you've done at the Roosevelt Institute that's argued for a green COVID economic recovery, which foregrounds climate change in response. And if you could start us off by just kind of making really clear what the linkages are between COVID recovery and climate change, then we can maybe dig a little deeper into it.
Sure. So I think I think of it as sort of three main linkages. The first is that, well, one of the reasons that we are in this predicament is because of factory farming and sort of a very concentrated, centralized approach to agriculture that is incidentally also a huge driver of emissions. And so you have this thing that is a huge driver of emissions that is also now contributing to pathogens mutating more and more frequently, to the point that you will now likely see more of these sort of pandemic like things happening, or at least see pathogens that we don't know how to contain, or that are sort of moving faster than we can create vaccines and medicines and antibiotics, et cetera. And so I think that's one linkage, and that's one linkage between sort of climate change and COVID. The second linkage is around hospitalization and mortality rates, particularly for people of color. So we're seeing that people of color are dying and being hospitalized at far higher rates from COVID-19. And especially, and I remember it was so striking in that first wave of COVID, when the hotspots were like New York, Detroit, Louisiana, New Orleans. And it was really striking to me, because I remember looking at a map and being like, it's almost as if you overlaid in frontline communities, like hotspots for environmental injustice. And they were basically the same places. And that's not an accident. Air pollution, fossil fuel pollution is really driving these comorbidities that are making people far more vulnerable to COVID and contributing to these deaths to these and because of pre-existing conditions, and that has so much to do with environmental injustice and racism. And so that's one linkage. And then if you're talking about the economy, that's another linkage. Like, these are our essential workers who are living in frontline communities and now being mowed through by COVID, and that clearly is going to have an effect on the ways that we can hang together as a society and how our economy works. And then the third linkage that I would say is that COVID response was not climate neutral, in the sense that, I forget, it's something like, was it 538? I can't remember the exact number, but like hundreds of fossil fuel companies got aid from COVID stimulus money, from COVID response money. And these, and the money that they got, by the way, clean energy didn't get any targeted support. They did not get support anywhere near the level of fossil fuel companies. And then what was sort of most egregious about it was, not only did they get support, which, okay, you have workers, you might want to keep them on, and that's what the money is for, but there was actually pressure from lobbyists and eventually Treasury and other folks, or Federal Reserve and other folks caved, where they actually changed the rules so that the money could be used to pay back existing debt, right? So it's not going to workers. This money is paying back existing debt for industries that were already sort of really strapped and struggling before. And there weren't conditions on stock buybacks, that the money had to go to workers, none of that it couldn't go to CEO pay. And that was allowed. And then as part of COVID response, the Federal Reserve also bought a bunch of junk bonds that were held by fossil fuel companies, ostensibly to sort of stabilize the economy, but they took on debt that they would literally never take on in any other circumstances. And they didn't take it on from every other industry, that type of debt. And so those are real linkages, because not only do you see that things that are created that are either drivers of the climate crisis or results of the climate crisis and environmental injustice are driving forward COVID, you're also seeing that the way that without sort of protections or stimulus money being conditioned on anything related to climate, without those sort of protections, the money isn't sort of being spread out neutrally. It's being sent to fossil fuel industries that are exacerbating the crisis with literally no strings attached to them.
Yeah. In the report, where you flesh out a lot of these ideas, and this will be my last question, so I can make sure I leave enough time for us to take questions from the audience. You outlined several specific policies that you think would be particularly effective in a COVID economic response that foregrounds or centralizes climate response. Could you talk us through some of those specifics and why they're so important and hold so much promise?
Yeah, and so in the paper that we wrote, we were really focused on sort of more short to medium term stimulus, because there's a lot of great ideas for sort of long-term stimulus around climate. And that comes back to a lot of the things in the Green New Deal, investing in clean energy infrastructure, directing money towards ARPA-E, right? So you can foster innovation, investing in frontline communities, just like a number of sort of the things that you would usually think of as a Green New Deal can happen in that sort of package. And so the things that we were talking about were more short or medium term, because even in those sort of short-term relief bills, you're moving a lot of money. And anytime you're moving a lot of money, you can change the economy or influence economic activity, which is all connected to emissions and whatnot. And so some of the things that we called out there, we focused on how do you drive money to people businesses, and states and localities, because those at the time, and even still now in this phase of recovery, those are largely the folks who have been left behind that stimulus hasn't really served. And so one of the things that we talked about is investing in LIHEAP, so low income housing, low income utility assistance and weatherization assistance, but also investing more into weatherization so that they can start installing like solar panels. Because right now, you might be able to get more insulation in your home, but we don't do things like equip homes with smart meters and put solar panels on people's homes. And so we're actually not connecting people to sort of clean energy in the ways that we could be, while also helping them pay their bills during a pandemic. And then, of course, returning that money to a local economy. Businesses, I mean, it's all sort of boring. Businesses, we talked to, there are tax credits that are very, very helpful for solar and wind businesses that you can make refundable, and grants, so you can sort of cut out private investment and sub in public investment for that. And so that's something that we called for too, to sort of help make up that imbalance between fossil fuel, what the fossil fuel companies got in the CARES Act and what clean energy should get going forward, because clean energy is like bleeding jobs right now. Because of the pandemic. And then for states and locals, we talked a lot about actually the federal government taking on responsibility for what's called like capital costs for infrastructure improvement. So basically right now, if a state is to say want to replace all their lead pipes, the state has to pay for that. This is a time where clearly states are going to be cutting their budgets, and that's likely not going to happen. So how can the federal government step up and essentially take on those obligations so that not only sort of states are able to maintain, but they're actually able to upgrade infrastructure systems, particularly around water and energy, so that they're able to change their infrastructure with public money during this time, and also get people back to work, moving us away from carbon intensive infrastructure to something else. And also, particularly in terms of water, just environmental justice issue, like just taking lead pipes out, which is a part of environmental, is an environment, or like a health hazard from a physical environment. So those are the sorts of things that we've talked about. And in addition, since then, we've started to talk about push for limiting the amount of aid to fossil fuels to only what can go to workers, and not allowing additional money to go to fossil fuels, particularly to take care of pre-existing debt, as well as we haven't argued for this, but other folks have, different sort of conditions around bailing out or helping carbon intensive industries like airlines. So requiring airlines to reduce emissions year after year if they take public money as part of their bailout, or as part of sort of COVID response, COVID stimulus, that they have to sort of start reducing their emissions, and that sort of thing.
Are you seeing some traction in Washington on some of these ideas under the new administration?
Oh yeah, so LIHEAP, and I think there's a lot of support for increasing funding to LIHEAP and weatherization program, and there's precedent for that. And they already gave a little bit more money in the CARES Act, but there's support for more. The PTC and ITC, I haven't heard a lot about that, but there's certainly a lot of energy building for public investment in clean energy. So it might be those vehicles, it might be other vehicles. And then I haven't heard as much about states and local, like about that idea of taking on their responsibilities around for states and locals. So that one hasn't gotten as much traction, and I doubt that the pollution controls will go anywhere. They tried to do it in the first version of the CARES Act. It got shot down, so it doesn't seem to be much appetite among folks on the Hill to try it again.
Great, thanks. I could ask you questions all night, but I'm gonna let some other folks have and move over to some of the questions that our team behind the scenes is curating for me, and I will translate them over. So the first one is from Brianna, who's a Youth Sunrise Movement organizer. And Brianna asks, how can we approach representatives like Katie Porter who don't support the Green New Deal because they say it's not specific enough? To me, it's about making clear the foundation and framework of EJ for future legislation and a just transition, not necessarily a line-by-line layout.
So that's a really great question. And personally, I agree. But luckily, there are sort of more specific vehicles coming out. So one thing is that's already out is the Thrive resolution. And the Thrive resolution is essentially an outline of what economic recovery package should look like to be in line with the principles of the Green New Deal. And that is that's come out from the Green New Deal Network. And so that is sort of a more specific iteration, although only about economic recovery, that I think is helpful, and that a number of representatives have signed on to. I think there will be legislation sort of that will likely follow along those same lines. And so I would say use those vehicles. The Green New Deal is something that is continuing to move and grow. And that's the way that we created it. Part of the reason that it wasn't super fleshed out in the beginning is because we wanted it to be a collective exercise, to design it, to figure it out. And I think as part of that, what that means is that it's continuing to evolve and becoming more and more concrete in different forms. So I would say look out for those. And the Green New Deal Network is a really good place to look to see where Thrive is going, as well as other representatives are also putting forward. So there's like a Green New Deal from public housing, but there's also an increasing number of sort of suite of like Green New Deal bills. And those can also be used as organizing vehicles. So like there's likely going to be a Green New Deal for public schools coming out from some progressive reps. So things like that.
Great, thank you. A couple of folks have asked specifically about the military. So for example, from Joshua, was the US military's 47th emitter of greenhouse gases in the world pollution practices brought into the conversation when conceptualizing the Green New Deal? And also from Rosanna, who paraphrased as, is US DoD willing to make the changes to lower their carbon footprint?
So that is, I'm trying to think. So is DoD willing? Actually, it seems like yes, which is kind of an odd thing to say. But one, DoD in particular thinks about climate change as an issue of security, both national security and just sort of as a destabilizing force in just in terms of conflict and resources. And so they have actually been one of the departments or agencies that seems to be more proactive, or at least more concerned about climate. And that's, I mean, it's also selfish because they have bases, right, and equipment that can be destroyed by climate change. And that already has been. They've sustained a lot of damage from hurricanes and all sorts of things, all sorts of extreme weather events. And so, you know, they're already, I think, doing some planning. That being said, did we talk about it? Yes. And if I'm being completely honest, we didn't get into it for a couple of reasons. One, a conversation about greening the military isn't exactly where I think any of us really wanted the conversation about the military to go. And then second, I think a lot of it was a political calculation. We were already talking about so many things that were both new ideas and also unpopular, at least when we came out in 2018. And so the stance that we likely would have taken, which is, you know, take the money and put it somewhere else, it just seemed like, why start that fight too? Because we want this set of ideas to get heard. And that was basically, I think, where we ended up. And now, will that change? I think it's possible, especially now as the idea continues to like become more popular. I think we have more leverage to start talking about more things that maybe we couldn't, or we didn't feel like we could in the beginning. But again, I think like I would always want to do it from not a greening the military perspective. So yeah, but I am working with some coalitions that are thinking more about the role of militarism in climate change and how to approach that. So it's not my work, but I support them in their work, and we're trying to integrate it a bit more, I think.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Mike, who asks, I'm concerned about the momentum behind carbon markets, particularly as ways to address climate change impacts on agriculture. What's your perspective?
I don't like carbon markets personally. I think that honestly, anything that's taking us away from just removing emissions is, we just really don't have time for it. And also, I don't feel like we've been able to sort of structure a carbon market in a way that can't be gamed. And so that's my feelings on it. And particularly when it comes to agriculture, because we understand what we need to do to make agriculture not a source of emissions. So it seems like carbon markets in that situation, as opposed to say some like a sector like, I don't know, like steel, or so like heavy industry, there are places where we legitimately just aren't sure how to remove carbon. We're just not sure how to remove CO2 out of that process, right? We're not quite sure how to create steel. Well, steel is one that we're making, but like concrete without emissions. And so like those are things that like, okay, I wouldn't use a carbon market in that instance either, but I think there's a difference where you're trying to really figure out an interim solution for a thing where you're trying to figure out the long-term way to deal with it. Agriculture is not that. And so to me, a move to a carbon market is just going to slow down the changes that we actually need to have, which are about the structure of agriculture, the ways that we farm, the distance, like our reliance on food from all over instead of local food systems, et cetera. And I just think, and also in terms of political capital, I wouldn't want to spend a bunch of political capital setting up those carbon markets and then not have the capital to pursue these more concrete changes. So that's my feeling about carbon markets.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Melanie, who asks, with GM pledging to go all electric by 2035, and the 6 major oil companies now pledging billions into clean energy projects, it seems that large financial institutions still wield investment power and will stand to make the most with that reinvestment in the green wave. How can the benefits of new technologies coming to the market be put in the hands of the people in coming years?
That's a really good question. The benefits of new, I guess I'm not quite sure what that means too. The benefits of new technologies coming to the market be put in the hands of people in coming years. Like the ability to own. I guess I'm not really clear about the question, but I'll try my best. So yeah, large financial institutions still do hold a lot of that power. I think one of the ways that the benefits of new technologies can be put in the hands of the people, or at least not have the majority of the benefits accrue to private companies, or at least I should say private investment institutions or banks, is to establish a public investment vehicle. So people have talked about something like a national investment authority. In the New Deal, there was something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And that sort of thing is really helpful because it allows, particularly, it allows public investment in areas, one, where private investment isn't stepping up, but it allows essentially the public to invest directly and then to accrue the benefits of that the investment back so that it can be reinvested. And so I think that when I think about in terms of how do you sort of interrupt the dominance of private venture capital or large financial institutions, that's what I think about. So how that's what comes to mind is sort of ways to essentially create a public venture capital arm or a public investment authority that that does in fact, and other people have some ideas about this, but I believe that it should take equity or somehow benefit from those investments and then reinvest those funds, particularly into other priorities related to climate, but it could be a number of things. And I think the other thing with the National Investment Authority is it also allows you to have a bit more control over what new technologies come to market, in the sense that it can be guided by a set of priorities that are built around the public interest and around mitigating the effects of climate or environmental justice in ways that you can't expect private corporations to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Or private entities.
Thank you for that. The next kind of group of questions are asking for some elaboration about impacts on particular sets of communities. So the first one from Thierry is, what are your thoughts on current pipelines still happening through Indigenous land and the police response to Indigenous activists?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. And it's actually, when I talk about what the fossil fuel industry exists in the form that it does right now without white supremacy, I actually often think about pipelines still happening on Indigenous land. And for instance, like the Dakota Access Pipeline, that was originally sited through Bismarck, and which is 99% white. And they got that, they literally had a set of town meetings and it was rerouted. And it was rerouted through Indigenous land, even though that was illegal, even though they were breaking like a number of federal treaties. That was still allowed to happen. And that's all about an imbalance of power that's upheld by white supremacy. And so that's often how I sort of still see those fights, which is, I just feel like it's just a living example of what is possible when you have not only these racialized imbalances of power, but when you have systems that are literally built to keep them in place. And as far as a police response to Indigenous activists, I mean, it's actually really alarming to me, because in some ways it feels like we test the boundaries of what is possible in terms of police response on Indigenous activists, even down to, you know, these new laws. I can't remember exactly in which states, but that these new laws that try to criminalize protesting near fossil fuel infrastructure. That is a canary in the coal mine, because if you can do that, why can't they make those sorts of rules about any number of protests around any number of things? And so police responses to Indigenous activists just honestly also remind me of the ways that when we talk about environmental justice, it's not just physical environment, you're also talking about things like police brutality and police violence. And it reminds me once again how those two things are connected, and how if we really don't get a handle on climate change, the ways that police violence could very well be used to sort of hold these really strict boundaries around how resources are distributed, who's allowed to be where, who's allowed to protest, around what. And I just, yeah, I think that all of that is so tied together, and it makes me think about all of that all the time.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions about disproportionate impacts on particular communities. You talked about how climate change disproportionately impacts women, and Julia wants to know if you can elaborate on that. And I'll feed you the second one as well from Lindsay, who's asking a similar question, asking if there are disproportionate impacts on LGBT or disabled communities.
Yeah, so how climate change disproportionately impacts women, I am not an expert on that. So my understanding is that in a couple of ways, it disproportionately impacts women, I think health-wise. I can't remember exactly why. And I think also in terms of when I think about, at least when I think about the Green New Deal and the sort of need to transform the economy, I see really clearly how women can be left behind in that transition, especially in the wake of COVID-19, where we already see hundreds of thousands of women being pushed out of the labor force because, in large part, because of wage inequalities, discrimination in our workforce, and inadequate care. And so I think, and particularly when you think about care burdens and who's going to bear the brunt of people getting sick more often as climate change continues, who has to take off to take the baby to the doctor because it's getting hotter, which is cooking the smog and giving the baby asthma attacks, right? Like all of that is largely disproportionately women. And so, and particularly, and I think that that's really important. The care responsibilities part is really important because all of what we're talking about when it comes to climate change is going to have health effects. It's going to have really big effects on care and the need for care. And even if you're talking about like, there could be more pathogens or pandemic, like just think about how COVID-19 has really made clear how important care is and how lacking our care infrastructure is. And all of that falls on women, or most of that. Was there similar attention to LGBT or disabled communities? I don't know. I haven't seen any papers about it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? I just haven't seen them. And the ways, and thinking about when we were structuring the Green New Deal, we did think about LGBT and disabled communities for a couple of reasons. One, the New Deal left behind disabled folks too, and left them out of employment opportunities. And we know also when you're talking about changing so much physical infrastructure, you have to think about people with disabilities, and how that's going to affect them. And also how they'll have access to all of these jobs that are being created, because we know that they're also disproportionately left out of the workforce. And so what does that mean? And LGBT folks, I'll admit, I don't know about like if climate change has disproportionate effects on them, but we did think about that in terms, again, of employment and how accessible it will be and how folks are protected and protected from discrimination in those contexts. That's mostly how I've thought about it. But if people know if there's disproportionate impact, I would love to know.
Great, thank you. Time for a few more questions, hopefully. The next one's from Christopher. Is there any particular reason why the organizations behind the Green New Deal are newer or more recently created organizations instead of longtime environmental groups organizations?
That's a pretty easy answer. We didn't have any power. So we didn't have much to risk. Like when you think about longtime environmental groups and organizations, they have standing political relationships. They have often extensive donor networks or relationships with funders, and maintaining all of that um, requires sort of what do I want to say? It requires sort of access to power and an ability to um, to stay in people's, not, I shouldn't say stay in people's good graces, but just power, right? The way that you get more money from funders is to prove that you were effective in helping to pass something, or you talk to this legislator, you have this relationship. And that really can create some like really strong disincentives for saying things that are outside of the norm. And when we were saying this, like, I can't tell you the number of people who laughed at me personally and then laughed at the Green New Deal in general. Like, that was not, I think, a risk that they were willing to take, because that could threaten access to folks that they need to help pay their bills. And I think also part of it was also that a lot of longtime environmental groups and organizations are majority white.
Mhm.
And so I think the other reason that we were newer, that we did it, was that we were largely people of color, and young progressive people of color. And because the orgs were newer, we had the power to sort of do the things that we wanted to do within the org. And I think that that all was absent, both the people and the power to control what the org does. There weren't, like, people of color who control what the org does, they weren't there. And so I think these ideas just weren't being brought forward as much. And also they didn't have sort of a climate justice read on the crisis. And so they weren't going to bring these ideas forward, because when you sort of come at climate change as an outgrowth of these systems, you're really talking about, you end up at a different set of solutions than when you're just talking about emissions.
Yeah.
So if they don't have that framework, how would they get to that end point?
Yep. Thank you. I have 3 more questions in my queue right now. Maybe I'll group the first 2 together in hopes of getting to the third. So the first 2
I'll
are,
be quick.
okay, the first 2 are from Flora and Michelena. How should we be training undergraduates so they are well poised to address climate injustice? And what role do you think higher education should play in preparing people to get green jobs and thinking in a new Green Deal framework in their workplaces and positions of power?
I mean, I would say, like, train undergraduates from the framework of climate justice, from that understanding of the climate crisis. I can't stress how fundamental that is when it comes to how you will approach the problem. And I think the ways that people sort of see those connections or walk through those connections, honestly, I think they do happen best in higher education, when you have time to do all the readings and to have the discussions. And so I think that would be the biggest intervention, because people can't talk about the Green New Deal framework in their workplaces or positions of power if they don't know it. And they can't know it if they don't sort of think about climate change in a different way than I think they were likely taught to think about it in other settings.
Great. And then the last kind of paired questions from Kaya and Maceo. Tips for an environmental studies student preparing to graduate and pursue a career in climate justice, or something you wish you knew when you were starting out in your career, as well as what is the best way for a budding environmental activist to get involved in environmental justice work?
I'll start with the second one. The best way to get involved is to join a group, find people that you want to do this work with. And especially as a budding activist, organizers, honestly, I really believe that organizers are the true experts. So many people have been working on these issues for a long time. So if you want to know why a thing looks the way that it does in your community, they'll know. They'll likely know what bills pass, what person is in the way, like all sorts of things. So join a group, align yourself with someone, and just get involved in their mission and push that way. How to pursue a career in climate justice, or something. I'll say, I mean, I think pursuing a career in climate justice is, I don't think, I mean, it's the way you pursue, I think, a number of social justice careers or careers in, you'll probably end up in an NGO, although, I mean, government is a place now too. But I mean, I think you look for jobs the way that you look for jobs. I will say something I wish I knew starting out is that, like, there's so many ways to get to where you envision. There's so many paths. Don't stress about, like, if I don't get my first job in climate justice, there's so many ways to end up where you want to be. So just, I always say, I actually pick jobs based on who I'm going to work with, right? So if you can find someone who's invested in you and wants to train you, and you feel passionate about that, like, even if it's not exactly in line with climate justice, or like, even if it's not exactly what you had in mind, or maybe it's like tangentially related to climate justice, or it's on a part of climate justice you didn't study, like, it's totally fine. You can always, shouldn't say always, but life is generally kind of long, even though people tell you it's short. And you can find your way, even if it's not like right out the gate.
Great. Well, we sadly have come to the top of the hour. It's 7 o'clock. So it's time to end the session. I just want to thank you so much, Rhiana, for sharing your brilliance with us tonight. It was such an honor to have a chance to engage with you in conversation. And I really hope next time I'm in DC, we can have a cup of coffee.
Yeah, hopefully the world will have opened up.
Indeed, hopefully.
I miss outside.
And if anyone wants to learn more about the Institute for Social Transformation, we put the link in the chat. And thank you all so much for your time. Really appreciate everyone who showed up for this event. And special thanks to the Institute for sponsoring it. So thank you so much, Rhiana.
You're welcome.